Hello, my name is Josephine Baird. I'm a lecturer at the University of Uppsala Game Design Department, and this is a short lecture on surveys, interviews, and specifically consent. So, why is it important to consider surveys, interviews, and consent? Well, surveys and interviews are common methods to collect playtest data, in that they are very common methods in order to examine the ways in which players respond to games that you've designed. The choice of method is dependent on the data being sought and the research questions, but the method of data collection will also have an impact on the data that you're collecting. The experience of participants must be considered, and ethical imperatives must be paramount in relation to the testing conditions, but also to the data collected. So in short, these are very common approaches to studying games and their impact. The choice of how you do it is very much focused on what theoretical approach you're taking, what your intentions are, what you're looking for in the game design. But of course, being aware that your methods will have an impact on the actual data itself, and also keeping central the ethical concerns of dealing with the human participants of your study and how your study might impact them. So, surveys and interviews. Excuse me. Playtesting is most often including a study of player responses to a game design. So as such, we're often recording player experiences, and this is critical to a research approach and can be conducted in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, the choice of method is dependent on the needs of the test and specifically the research questions. And we'll talk about some of the strengths and drawbacks of each of these two approaches to studying the ways in which players might react to your game design. As I've mentioned, surveys, interviews are perhaps one of the most common methods for examining this, and we'll look into a little bit why. But let's start with surveys. Playtest surveys often tend to be made up of a series of questions delivered either verbally or textually, in that sense that you can give these preset questions usually in a verbal fashion. Let me ask you, did you find this game compelling? Yes or no? A little bit of a leading question there. We'll talk about leading questions in a minute. Or textually, as in literally in a form, or sometimes in an online document. Surveys lend themselves specifically to quantitative data gathering, with questions often being presented on, for example, a Likert scale. Now, by quantitative data gathering, I mean anything that can be quantitated. This means usually translated very easily into a numerical format. So, for example, a survey that has a Likert scale. Now, a Likert scale you've probably come across many times in your life. It's any question where you're asked to give a response on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 9 or 1 to 3. So for example, did you find that this game gave you a sense of joy? Rate it from 1 to 5, 1 being joyful, 5 being not joyful, and then there being grades in the middle. That's a Likert scale. And a Likert scale is often employed because it is easily quantifiable. A numerical value is often being able to given to that question. So this allows for gathering of often significant quantities of information and also allows for a quick comparison between those responses. So if you have a numerical value, say, for example, on a Likert scale, you can do that with a lot of people very quickly, right? You can give that form to anybody who can access it, and they can give a numerical value, and those numerical values can be added up very quickly and very easily and quickly compared to others because there's no further data analysis required. It's just a number and it's there. It allows for very quick comparison, often between very large data sets. So this is useful for certain kinds of research questions and approaches that often require perhaps a very particular answer to a well-defined question or criteria. Having a very clear idea of exactly what you want that can be easily quantifiable lends itself very well to this kind of approach. A quantitative approach to this can be really useful. So one example of a survey might be a playtest feedback form. And these are often composed of a series of questions chosen in relation to the research question and the design goals of the project. So considering what you want to learn through your game design, you design a series of questions that are pertinent to that, put them on a form, often with a Likert scale or some kind of quantifiable answer, and you create a form and people can fill that out. These can often be done quickly. They're often either done at the end of a play experience or sometimes during, and can provide a very quick response to a quantifiable experience of the player. Now, An entirely quantitative survey would feature questions that can be easily collated numerically, such as the Likert scale I've just mentioned, or yes/no responses. However, surveys can also include open-ended questions, which can allow respondents to provide free and open responses, in the sense that you can provide, even on a form like this, a question which says, describe your experience of this aspect of the game. How did you feel this particular mechanic worked for you? And then provide a box for the person to give in a response that is of their own, and that does not get quantified, that cannot be easily put into a numerical value. This is a qualitative approach and would need to be analyzed using a different method or approach. Now, surveys can include entirely quantitative questions like the Likert scale ones. Surveys can also include entirely qualitative questions like the open-ended ones, but surveys can also include a mixture of the two. The mixture approach is advantageous because it allows for results to be triangulated or contextualized. So if you provide a quantitative method, this is the Likert scale. Now tell us a little bit why you think that is true, or have a question that relates to that. You can then compare the two answers to see if there's context given to a particular question. So if someone says that the game gives them particular joy through the Likert scale, and you ask them what their experience of the game was in general, and they said, oh, I like the game okay, but this part was particularly good, and that's what made me happy. That particular part now contextualized the Likert scale. Now, if you only had the quantitative question, you wouldn't have had the context. You wouldn't have known that specific element might have been useful. And that's why sometimes a mixture approach can be quite useful. Also, open-ended questions can allow respondents to provide information that was not anticipated by the designer or researcher. So you may have created a very, very well put together quantitative set of questions, but you haven't anticipated a specific impact of your game. An open-ended question can allow a respondent to give you that information, despite the fact that you didn't necessarily think about it before you created the survey or indeed the game. Now, the choice of how you formulate questions is an entire field of study in itself. Creating survey questions is an art form. And to summarize it in short, it's important to consider the influence that a question and its format can have on the respondent. So this can be accounted for by being careful in your theoretical consideration of question formation, and also considering your position as a researcher, what impact you might have, and of course, above all, the ethical standards being adhered to. If you're interested in this, I recommend reading wider on the ways in which survey questions can be formed, the impact that they might have, the leading quality of certain questions, and how you can mitigate them. Now, the way that you mitigate that is actually going to be kind of dependent on what you're actually studying, and you need to be careful. Now, no survey question is perfect, but we can try to account for these things. And when I say research positioning, what I mean is that your impact as a researcher can also have an influence on the results. Simply being in a room or having a certain kind of relationship with the respondents will have an impact on their answers. Just being aware of that is important. You can't entirely remove that element of impact, and that's not necessary. Just being aware of it, allowing yourself to include that information, being considerate of it is important. And of course, remembering the ethical standards that we need to adhere to. Now, we're going to talk about that a bit more in the next section. But for example, even in surveys, we need to be very careful about what we're actually asking, what impact the question may have on the respondents. Maybe it can be quite challenging to be asked, say, a personal question on a sensitive topic in a game that's designed to have another kind of impact. So things to be considerate of, even if you're just gathering data about someone's background, for example, something that most questionnaires and surveys tend to do. Tell me about your job, tell me about who you are, where you come from, ethnicity, age, disability. These things people tend to collect without really thinking about it, but can be challenging and can be very, very tricky. And I often argue, consider very carefully why you're asking something. So even if it's demographic, consider why you're asking about that demographic. Are you actually going to account for the differences in players and their particular demographic background? And if you are, it's definitely worth considering how you ask those questions and the impact it might have, as well as looking at the wording of how you might put those questions in a way that is both sensitive to the respondent and gets you the data that you're looking for. Now, to move on to interviews. Interviews are commonly associated with more qualitative methodologies. However, they too can be conducted in a number of different ways depending on the research questions and the approach, and of course the game design itself. Entirely open-ended interviews will allow respondents to provide a broad response on the design, but may not give you specific feedback on the areas of interest of you as a designer. So it can be a very broad response, but you may not get the specific thing that you're actually looking for. Structured interviews are kind of on the opposite end of the scale. These involve having a series of predetermined questions which are chosen in relation to research questions and specific interests of the designer. Now, this can lead to very specific feedback, but may also exclude certain experiences or unanticipated results, very similar to the surveys here. So if you think about what we said about the surveys, if you ask very structured questions, very numerical ones, you may get a very specific answer to something that you're interested in, but you may not get context and you may not get the unexpected results. So a semi-structured interview often mixes the two with some predetermined questions or areas of interest, but also with the opportunity for respondents to provide their own responses and topics. Now, there is no definitive choice of how you should do this. The choice of your approach will be determined by the research goals of you as a designer and the way in which the data will be analyzed and used afterwards. So you may want to use one of these methods because you are looking for a specific thing, or you want to have a broad sort of approach to find out generally what people think. A semi-structured approach might be useful if you're trying to provide context to specific answers, but also remembering that the way you're going to analyze the data and what you're then going to use it for has an impact on the ways in which you would structure your interview. Now, whatever method you approach, whether you're collecting data from respondents quantitatively or qualitatively, with surveys and interviews, or any other method, it is critical to consider the potential impact of your research on the individuals who are doing the testing, right? This includes every aspect of your research project. It includes the playtest itself, so the experience of playing the game needs to be considered. And in any also data gathering that you then conduct either extraneously to the playtest or inside it. So for example, if you're doing any kind of recording or observation, ethical implications of that need to be considered. If you're gathering any kind of data through, say, a survey or interview, there are very specific ethical implications for that as well. And of course, simply the playtest environment. But you can also consider it in all sorts of areas. For example, the space that you're in, the access to the building, the access to the materials that a person may need, the kinds of impacts that those things may have. Having a very, full approach to this is really imperative and something I highly encourage, and to be included at the very beginning of your design process, and also when you're thinking about how you can conduct your research. So considerations of ethics in research is, of course, a topic also all of itself. It is a massive field. But in short, the simple principle is this: the risk to the respondents, the people who are doing your testing, must be minimized in every circumstance. In the sense that if, for example, your game has something to do with a sensitive topic, you need to be very mindful of that. You need to explain to your players that this topic is what is going to be examined, surprising them with certain elements. This may seem like a good research method, and in some cases it may be the way to go, but it's not considered very positive, and it's often not looked well upon by, say, for example, ethics boards. You'd have to be able to convince them that your research is important enough and that you can only be found out by doing something like this. And there are considerations as to how you could do that. In short, for me, with projects like this, informed consent is absolutely critical, which means that the player knows what they're getting into. They know what's being asked of them. Say, this is the playtest experience you're going to have. This is the kind of information we're going to ask of you. And this is how it's going to be stored. This is how we're going to communicate it to others. And this is how we're going to pseudo-anonymize it. Now, that's a very long word. That means basically trying to make the data as anonymous as possible. Say, if someone provides an interview, the common practice is to change the name of the person who's providing the interview. You don't give their real name. You also might remove any details that might tell a person who they are, say personal details of where they come from, what jobs they're in, what they're doing. Those details may be extraneous perhaps to your research project and can be anonymized in some way. Often, say, for example, if there's a survey data, you might provide a code or letter to an individual respondent so that they are pretty much anonymous, but they're not entirely anonymous. That's the thing. You can never entirely anonymize data, especially at a point in time where algorithms and data collection can allow someone to create a very full picture of someone, even with what seems to be anonymized data. So that's how we call this pseudo-anonymized. Data isn't ever entirely anonymized, and the the respondent needs to know this when they're coming into this. They need to be made aware that you're going to make their data as anonymous as possible, but there is a ever so slight risk that they could be identified no matter what. And the same thing with any ethical standard. Risk can be minimized. It can never be entirely removed. We make spaces safer. We can't make them safe. And this is true throughout any aspect of life, any aspect of play. Everything can have an unintended impact. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but you must minimize that. And you must be very mindful of it as well. Okay? So there are, this is particularly important in tests and games that involve sensitive information. And as we mentioned, so any topic that can be difficult or challenging, whether it be something that deals with an emotional experience, for example, or ask someone to engage with a particularly tricky topic. These considerations are critical in every research project, but will have even more implications in those cases. There is an argument to be made that when you collect the data, that you allow participants to have some sort of access to it, in the sense that you might be able to show them what you've written about them. You might show them the survey data. You might show them the questionnaire data related to them as a person. This gives them the right to respond or even to make corrections. This is particularly an important approach if you're doing something in relationship to, again, sensitive subjects, but also in relationship to, for example, participatory research. And that's a methodology in which the knowledge is created in a participatory form with everybody involved, in the sense that you are creating an experience or a game environment with your participants, and they have more significant input on the research and results that you may have. If you're interested in that, one area to look into would be, say, for example, participatory action research, where this is a topic that is argued for and discussed, and how you might go about that. But whatever format that you decide to consider ethics in and informed consent, the respondent must also always be given the option to withdraw from your research project, no matter what. They should be allowed the opportunity to remove their data, to be able to take their data out of the research project, to take themselves out of the research project at any time during that project. This is also an element of informed consent. This is critical. You'll see it on most research and ethics forums these days, and it can feel very scary as a researcher to give someone that option. Of course, it means your data might disappear, and everybody does it, then all your data goes away. But the truth is, if you consider the ethical approach and the impact on the player carefully enough, that risk to you as a researcher is also minimized. And it's important to be aware that someone should have that option at all times. So reducing the potential negative impact, considering their informed consent, telling them what the experience is going to be, telling them what their data is going to be used for, how it's going to be disseminated, and that they can withdraw that at any time, and even perhaps giving them the option to look at that data and how it's being analyzed and how they're being represented in your work can be a really, really good approach to not only ethical consideration, but I argue makes your work more robust. It means that your work is probably going to be able to resist scrutiny on certain levels, and you're going to get a fuller response. I am a huge advocate for this, not only in relationship to being a positive impact on your players, because hopefully that is what you're looking for no matter what your game design, but also for creating good research and developing good and ethical and interesting knowledge. So, in summary, surveys, interviews, and consent. Surveys and interviews are commonly used to gather data on player experience in game design. You see that throughout research. You see it even in game design in a sort of more entertainment sector or business sector. Surveys and interviews are often used in order to gain knowledge about the player experience, even to do quality assurance. Now, these methods can be applied quantitatively, where you apply a numerical value very easily to the response, and or qualitatively, which provides a more open-ended response that needs to then be analyzed with a different methodology. The choice of what you do and how you do is very much dependent on the research question and your methodological considerations. It has to be part of that overall consideration. The impact of the methodology must be considered in relation to the data, but most especially in relation to the respondents. The impact of how you analyze, how you gather data, how you conduct your test is going to have an impact on the knowledge you create, but it's also going to have an impact on the people who are giving you that feedback. So therefore, ethical standards and data pseudo-anonymization must be considered and employed to minimize potential negative impact on those people who have kindly agreed to test your game and give you the knowledge that you need to create your conclusions and research. Utterly, completely imperative. I cannot stress that enough. But also hopefully exciting and interesting, and a way to consider how you create knowledge for a positive and good impact. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful. My name has been Josephine Baird. As I've said, I am a lecturer at the University of Uppsala Game Design Department. Feel free to be in touch, and I hope this has been a useful lecture.